Good evening. It's good to see you all out. Let me back up just a hair. Want to make sure we got some pews open. I want to commend all those who went out to the nursing home. I think Jerry got a count, and we had 50 people out there. So that was awesome, and the singing was great. And so I want to commend all those people who went out there and sang praises to God, and it was an uplifting time. And there were people who were not members of the church that came and talked to us about that. So you just never know. You never know the opportunities that you might have to make a good example for the cause of Christ, and even might lead to Bible studies and the gospel being shared. So I want to thank you for that. Tonight I was kind of wondering, we just finished this long study on the minor prophets. I was like, where do we go from here? And I didn't know. So I thought maybe we can do something that combines a little bit of the old with a little bit of the new and make it, I don't want to say real, but maybe make it real for us that we can be better Christians for God. Now, I want to ask you a question. Are you leaven? Are you leaven? Be careful before you answer. Because, David, have you quit beating your wife? This week? Okay. You know, that's a question. If I ask you, you're in trouble no matter how. Because if you say no, then you're still beating your wife. If you say yes, that means you beat your wife and you have quit, but you were beating her. So, I mean, think about it before you answer. And I want you to keep that question in your mind. Are you leaven? Are you leaven? Now, we're going to come back to that, but Bruce Metzger, he's a renowned Greek scholar, said in Bible times, leaven was a piece of fermented dough from previous baking that was placed in new dough, causing it to rise. I need to take a moment of silence for a rest in peace, Earl. Many of y'all don't know what that is, but Charlie gave us some bread, or Ashley gave us some bread starter. And it's alive. You have to feed the stuff. And Sheila named it Earl. And we had some good bread from Earl. Earl passed away the other day. So we're going to have some more bread starter. But it's comparable to yeast. So if you know anything about baking bread, then leaven will help that bread rise. Now, again, remember, I want you to make this personal. I made it personal when I was working on it, so I stepped on my toes a little bit. But are you leaven? Are you leaven? Now, I'm going to give a little history lesson. Then we will look at some points made in the New Testament in regards to leaven, and then the lesson will be yours. I only have almost 2 pages of ready recollections. So we won't, hopefully, I know I'm exhausted. I'm just going to lay it out there. So I'm going to move on through the history lesson so nobody goes to sleep. But leaven was prohibited in the food offerings that were given to the Lord by fire. We find in the Holiness Code, it's the book of Leviticus is called, that book for the priests. It was for everyone, but there were some specific instructions for the priest. But we find that in Leviticus 2:11. I'm not going to read these passages for time's sake. However, it was required in bread for a peace offering. And we find that in Leviticus 7 and verse 13. Also, leaven was to be offered in 2 wave loaves in the Feast of Weeks. We would call that Pentecost, Leviticus 23 and verse 17. Now, during the Exodus, Israelites ate unleavened bread. They were getting ready for a hasty departure from Egypt. They didn't have time for bread to rise. So they had to prepare unleavened bread. Now, we call that later the Passover feast, and I'll tell you about that. But we understand we take the Passover now, don't we? Because Jesus is our Passover today. And when we take Lord's Supper, it's almost as if they were delivered from physical slavery. We are reminded that we are delivered from spiritual slavery through the blood of Jesus Christ and His atoning sacrifice. when we take of the Lord's Supper today. Now, at the beginning of Passover season, every year leaven was to be expelled from the house. We find that in Exodus 12, 14, and 15. If you want these scriptures, get with me afterwards and I'll give it. And it was to be kept from the house 7 days, Exodus 12, 19. So you're seeing some positives and some negatives in regard to leaven. And this was called the feast or days of unleavened bread. And in Acts chapter 12, that's when Peter was taken captive during that day, Acts chapter 12 and verse 3. But in Exodus 23:15, we find that this was the feast of unleavened bread. And this is when Jesus instituted the Lord's Supper during this time, during Passover. He instituted the Lord's Supper, which we commemorate weekly according to Acts 20 and verse 7. So there's your brief, quick history lesson on leaven. If you want the passages, get with me after. But let's bring that to the New Testament. If you will, turn with me to Matthew 16. Matthew chapter 16. And we will briefly look at verses 5 through 12. I'm going to read those words of Jesus to you, and some of Matthew's inspired writing. But it says there in Matthew 16, 5 through 12, "Now when his disciples had come to the other side, they had forgotten to take bread. Then Jesus said to them, 'Take heed and beware of the leaven.'" You get that? "Take heed and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees." And they reasoned among themselves, saying, "Is it because we have taken no bread?" But Jesus, being aware of it, said, "O you of little faith, why do you reason among yourselves because you have brought no bread? Do you not yet understand or remember the 5 loaves of the 5,000 and how many baskets you took up? Nor the 7 loaves of the 4,000 and how many large baskets you took up? How is it that you do not understand that I did not speak concerning bread?" The stage was set because in verse 1, the Pharisees and Sadducees had came testing him and asking them to show them a sign. He had already given them signs. And that's the point. They didn't need another sign. An evil and adulterous generation, what? Seeks after a sign. But here we find, then they understood. He said again, "But beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees." Then they understood that he did not tell them to beware of the leaven of bread, but of the doctrine of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Here, leaven is used as a metaphor both for doctrine and for influence. The Pharisees had an influence. The thing is, both of them had a negative influence. They could not influence for the cause of Christ because they had the wrong perspective. The Sadducees were trying to get God to act. They wanted God to act in a political fashion. They had joined themselves to the government. The Sadducees were very political, and I'm sure you've heard it, but if you haven't, indulge me for a second. The way you tell the difference between a Pharisee and a Sadducee, and I know y'all have heard it, y'all been to preaching school, so y'all have heard this. The way to tell the difference between the two, the Sadducees did not believe in the angels, the resurrection, or the Spirit. And that's sad, you see. The Pharisees believed in both, so that's fair, I see. But the point is, the Sadducees were very political and their doctrine led to doom. They believed pretty much just in the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, and that was it for them. Now, when you bring it home, Jesus didn't really have many confrontations with the Sadducees because they were pretty sad, you see. He didn't have to because they were so far gone, there wasn't much that he could do with them. But I'm not saying that they were hopeless. Don't get me wrong. The preacher said there was a group of people that were hopeless. I did not say that. Now the Pharisees, let's come home because he had a lot of confrontations with the Pharisees. Now they didn't practice the doctrine they taught. They were elitist. And Jesus called them hypocrites. And you find that in Luke 12, 1 and 2. In the meantime, when an innumerable multitude of people had gathered together, so that they trampled one another, he began to say to his disciples, first of all, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. For there is nothing covered that will not be revealed, nor hidden that will not be known. See, the Pharisees appeared very religious. They appeared like the epitome of religion, if you will. When you looked at a Pharisee in that day, you would think, man, he has got it together. And the problem is, they thought they had it together, didn't they? You remember Luke 18, that Pharisee, the publican, and the tax collector? The Pharisee and the tax collector? You remember that, right? He stood and he told God how privileged God was to have him. And if we're not careful, we can take that attitude. Boy, God, you are lucky to have me. We don't need to have that. We need to have a humble attitude, and they did not have it. And you find that Jesus had to use them as an illustration of what not to do in religion. And in Matthew 6, in verse 2, therefore, when you do a charitable deed, do not sound a trumpet before you as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may have glory from men. Assuredly, I say to you, they have their reward. Verse 5, and when you pray, you shall not be like the hypocrites, for they love to pray standing in the synagogues and on the corners of the streets, that they may be seen by men. Assuredly, I say to you, they have their reward. Verse 16, just some highlights. Moreover, when you fast, do not be like the hypocrites, for with a sad countenance, for they disfigure their faces, and that they may appear to men to be fasting. Assuredly, I say to you, they have their reward. Jesus has already said there is nothing covered that won't be uncovered. And for us, if we are not practicing what we preach, we may appear great to the church, but God knows our heart. And we need to remember that always. We need to remember their focus was on the outward. But we know that God focuses on the what? The heart. So let's be careful what we teach about the externals. I get covering up. But let's be careful about what we bind. See, the Pharisees' doctrine led to doom, and Jesus, there towards the end of his life, had to preach a little sermon to them that was not a very comfortable sermon. And just a few highlights. He said in verse 13 of Matthew 23, but woe to you. He's saying, pity on you, scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites, for you shut up the kingdom of heaven against men. For you neither go in yourselves, nor do you allow those who are entering to go in. See, they were trying to hinder the kingdom, the growth of the kingdom. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you devour widows' houses, and for a pretense make long prayers. He's already mentioned that earlier. Therefore you will receive greater condemnation. Woe to you, scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites! For you travel land and sea to win one proselyte, and when he is won, you make him twice as much a son of hell as yourselves. That word's not used very much. That's very strong language from Jesus' lips himself. In verse 23, woe to you, scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites, for you pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faith. These you ought to have done without leaving the others undone. See, if we're not careful, we can fall into that category. Do you remember in Revelation 2 and 3, there were 7 churches of Asia Minor, right? Right, there was. 7 churches. The first one that Jesus talked to had this problem. They got their doctrine right, boy. Woo! False teachers come in, they put them down. But they didn't have love in their hearts. They had left their first love. They had left the love they had at the first of their works. Their motivation was Jesus. But then it slipped into something else. I'm grateful I don't think we have that problem here. At least I hope we don't. But here, leaven illustrates moral corruption. See, the Pharisees were morally bankrupt. They looked good, but that was about it. That was about it. They appeared religious, but that was about it. See, our religion must go and penetrate our hearts. We've got to have those traits that Jesus talked about. Justice, mercy, and faith. Do we have those things? See, the Sadducees, they were politically corrupt. And we can be that way too if we get so hung up in politics, we forget what we're here for. So there's a lesson in and of itself. But beware of the leaven, the doctrine, the influence of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Let's not be like that. Let's be true Christians. Okay? Good? I'm getting some long faces. Does that mean we're all in here Pharisees and Sadducees? I hope not. Go with me to 1 Corinthians chapter 5. 1 Corinthians chapter 5. I'm going to pick up the pace a little bit. Jerry has already covered this, so I won't go over it in detail, although I know all of you were not in here. Here, we find in verse 6 through 8, your glorying is not good. Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? It doesn't take much leaven to... Therefore, purge out the old leaven, that you may be a new lump, since you are truly unleavened. For indeed Christ, our Passover, we mentioned that already, was sacrificed for us. Therefore, let us keep the feast, not with old leaven, nor with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. See, Paul here is using leaven to represent the destructive nature of sin within the church. This man was having his father's wife, mother-in-law, I don't know who it was in that relationship. I really don't care. What I do care about is that this man was in sin and they were glorified. They weren't worried about it at all. They didn't care. I don't care. They were puffed up about it. You going to talk to me about that? About going? I'm not going to go to him. I don't. Do we care about people who have drifted away from the flock? It had gotten so bad that it said that it was actually or commonly reported. I mean, it had got out all over the place. Sin in the church. And the Christians here were called arrogant in verse 2. And you are puffed up or arrogant and have not rather mourned. You know, blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. That's about mourning sin. And we should mourn when others are in sin and want to go to them. He who has done this deed might be taken away from among them. Fine, in verses 11 through 13, Paul had to clarify something. He was not saying to leave the world. We got to be in the world to save the world, help save the world by spreading the gospel. But we can't be of the world. And he told them, he corrected that situation. I didn't mean not to be with the sexually immoral. They got to have a cure, right? The cure is the blood of Jesus. But now I have written to you not to keep company with anyone named a brother who is sexually immoral or covetous or an idolater or a reviler or a drunkard or an extortioner, not to even eat with such a person. Now we'd say, man, that's hateful. What is the point? We're so concerned about soul, our soul, and we should be. And we must exercise discipline in the church. Someone said that's the most forgotten command in the church. In verse 5, the desire is that they be restored. And if you read, I'm wrong, if I am, you can correct me, but I believe you find in 2 Corinthians 2, 6 through 8, that this man was restored after he was withdrawn from. But let me warn you, if we don't have the love of Christ within a congregation, if we don't have true fellowship within the congregation, you can withdraw all you want. If they don't understand fellowship, if they don't understand the need for God's family, you can withdraw from them. They won't know. So we best be exercising that love, that justice, that mercy, that faith that we are to. Now, let's move on. The kingdom of heaven we find in Matthew 13, and this is where I hope we all find ourselves. The kingdom of heaven is like leaven. It's like leaven. Matthew 13, 33 through 35. Another parable he spoke to them. The kingdom of heaven is like leaven, which a woman took and hid in 3 measures of meal, till it was all leavened. All these things Jesus spoke to the multitudes in parables, and without a parable he did not speak to them, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the prophet, saying, I will open my mouth in parables, I will utter things kept secret from the foundation of the world. The church was always in the mind of God. Do you believe that? It was always, just like our salvation through the precious blood of the Lamb, being redeemed with incorruptible things, not corruptible things, like 1 Peter 1, 18 through 20 tells us, that precious blood that Jesus shed for us, so that we could be part of the kingdom, because it's only the kingdom that's going to be delivered up to God. And that kingdom is the church. We find in Matthew 16 and verse 18, and Colossians 1, 13 and 18. I'm going to read that Colossian account that Paul wrote to the brethren in Colossae. As soon as I get over there. Colossians 1, 13. He has delivered us from the power of darkness and conveyed us into the kingdom of the Son of His love, in whom we have redemption through His blood, the forgiveness of sin. Drop down to verse 18. And He is the head of the body, the church, who is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead. He rose again, never to die again, that all things He may have the preeminence. Of course, Daniel prophesied of this kingdom coming in Daniel 2 and verse 44. And it would be an eternal kingdom. Why? Because this kingdom will last forever. The church will last forever. This building? No. The hearts, our spirits will last forever. And that's what the kingdom is all about. So, the point he's making here is the kingdom was to grow. Did the kingdom have a great start and growth? You better believe it did. 3,000, 5,000 added. The church was growing exponentially in the first century. The question is, why has church growth slacked off? Maybe it's because there's a focus on a different kind of growth. Where, if you're going to have numerical growth, where must it first start? With me, with you. We are the kingdom, and we must be growing spiritually if we plan on bringing other people into the fold. And I'm not just talking, there's congregations that baptize a lot of people, but they never develop into full-grown Christians. I'm more worried right now about our growth. I guess I should say concerned. We've talked about worry, I think. I'm concerned about my growth. I'm concerned about your growth. Let us get in the Word. As Jerry challenged us this morning, let us be about growing, feasting on this meal that God has laid before us so that we can grow. We can help the church grow by our influence, by our benevolence, by our willingness to share the gospel of Jesus Christ with our fellow man. Now, I want to ask you again as we get ready to wrap this up. Are you leaven? There may be a better question to ask. What kind of leaven are you? I'm asking myself that too. What kind of leaven? We sure don't want to be like the Pharisees and Sadducees. We don't want to be sin in the church, do we? I know we don't. None of us in here want that. Are we the kingdom of heaven kind of leaven? And I hope we are. because that's the kind of leaven that God desires us to be. And as God's leaven, let us make sure our lives are showing Jesus to others. Let us continually grow in our love for the lost, in our love to grow for God. Let us think grow and pray for opportunities to serve in God's kingdom, as well as share the gospel of Jesus Christ. Tonight, have you responded to that gospel? Because you're some other kind of leaven then. And that's not the kind of leaven you need to be if you have not. So tonight, the challenge is, if you have not obeyed the gospel, do it. Why are you waiting? On the flip side, if you have, and you've not been the right kind of leaven, we urge you to come. We're here. We're not here to judge you. We're here because we love you. And we want everybody in here to go to heaven one day and be together forever. Does everybody in here want that? I hope so. I know I do. Let's go to heaven. Is that okay? Is that okay? The invitation's open as together we stand and sing.